Luis never imagined that emptying trash cans at 3 in the morning would change his entire life. As he pushed his janitor's cart down the gleaming marble hallway of Meridian Corporate Tower, he heard voices echoing from the executive boardroom. What he overheard that night would shatter his quiet world and thrust him into a battle he never asked for, but one that would prove just how wrong powerful people can be about the strength of a father's love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Phoenix heat still radiated from the concrete as Luis Martinez wheeled his cleaning cart through the employee entrance of Meridian Corporate Tower. At 34, he had the calloused hands of a man who worked nights so he could be present during his 8-year-old son Miguel's days. The building's air conditioning hit him like a wall of relief as he made his way to the service elevator, the familiar weight of his keys jingling against his maintenance uniform. Luis had been cleaning these floors for 3 years, ever since his wife Sofia passed away from cancer. The night shift paid better than day work, and more importantly, it meant he could walk Miguel to school each morning and pick him up each afternoon. The other janitors thought he was crazy for choosing the graveyard hours, but they didn't understand what it meant to be the only parent left standing. The 20th floor housed the executive offices, where Luis always started his rounds. The marble gleamed under the soft security lighting, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Phoenix's sprawling lights that never failed to take his breath away. He began methodically emptying wastebaskets and wiping down conference tables, his movements efficient from years of practice. As he approached the corner office belonging to Rebecca Chen, CEO of Meridian Medical Technologies, he noticed the lights were still on. This wasn't unusual. Rebecca often worked late into the night, her silhouette visible through the frosted glass as she hunched over reports and conference calls with overseas partners. What was unusual was the sound of crying coming from inside. Luis paused, his hand frozen on the door handle. He had strict instructions never to disturb executives after hours, but something about the sound made his chest tighten. It wasn't the controlled tears of someone handling business stress. This was the raw, desperate sobbing of a parent in crisis. Through the partially open door, he could see Rebecca collapsed in her leather chair, her usually perfect black hair disheveled, her designer suit wrinkled from hours of strain. Her phone lay face up on the mahogany desk, and Luis could make out the words, "Phoenix Children's Hospital," on the caller ID display. Luis knocked gently on the doorframe. Rebecca's head snapped up, her eyes red and swollen, mascara streaked down her cheeks. For a moment, she looked vulnerable and human, rather than the intimidating figure who commanded respect from everyone in the building. "I'm sorry," Luis said quietly, his accented English careful and respectful. "I heard. Is everything okay? Do you need me to call someone?" Rebecca stared at him as if she'd forgotten other people existed. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to regain her composure, but her voice cracked when she spoke. "My daughter," she whispered. "There's been an accident." Luis had learned to recognize the sound of a parent's breaking heart because he'd heard it echo in his own chest for 3 years. As he stood in Rebecca's office doorway watching this powerful woman crumble under the weight of fear, he saw himself on that terrible October night when the doctors had first said the word cancer in connection with Sofia's name. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Without asking permission, Luis stepped into the office and quietly closed the door behind him. He'd been fired from jobs for less, but something deeper than job security was driving him now. He grabbed the box of tissues from the credenza and placed it within Rebecca's reach, then settled into the chair across from her desk. His janitor's uniform, a stark contrast to the leather and mahogany surrounding them. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. Rebecca's story came out in fragments between tears. Emma, her 9-year-old daughter, had been at horseback riding lessons in Scottsdale when her mare spooked during a jump. The fall had been catastrophic. 3 vertebrae compressed, spinal cord damaged, and the doctors were using words like incomplete injury and limited mobility and extensive rehabilitation. Emma was alive, but the life she'd known was over. As Rebecca spoke, Luis found himself transported back to his own nightmare. Sofia had been 31 when they found the tumor, the same age Emma was young to face such a mountain. Luis remembered sitting in sterile hospital waiting rooms, holding Sofia's hand as she worried not about dying, but about leaving him alone to raise Miguel. He remembered the way she'd made him promise to find love again, to give Miguel a mother who could be there for all the moments she would miss. Luis had grown up in Maryvale, the son of Maria Martinez, who cleaned houses for wealthy families in Paradise Valley. His father had left when Luis was 7, leaving Maria to work 3 jobs to keep food on the table and Luis in school. She'd taught him that dignity came from honest work, not from the size of your paycheck, and that helping others was never optional when you had the ability to do so. When Luis graduated high school, Maria had begged him to go to college, but the money wasn't there, and someone needed to help support the family. He'd started as a maintenance worker at a hotel, learning plumbing and electrical work during slow periods. By 25, he could fix almost anything with moving parts, but his real gift was with people. Guests would seek him out specifically because Luis remembered their names, their children's ages, their favorite room temperature. He made people feel seen. Sofia had been a server at the hotel restaurant when they met. She was studying to become a medical technician at Phoenix College, working nights to pay for her courses. Luis had been immediately smitten by her laugh, the way she could diffuse angry customers with genuine warmth, and her absolute determination to build a better life through education. She'd been born in Mexico City and brought to Phoenix as a child, and she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd learned early that the world wouldn't hand her anything. Their courtship had been slow and careful. Luis would leave small gifts at her workstation, fresh flowers from the hotel garden, or coffee exactly how she liked it during her break. Sofia had been cautious about dating, focused entirely on her studies, but Luis's persistence had worn down her defenses. He'd proposed on the night she graduated from her medical technology program, presenting her with a ring that had cost him 3 months of savings and was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever purchased. Miguel had arrived 2 years later, during a monsoon storm that knocked out power across half of Phoenix. Luis had driven through flooded streets to get Sofia to the hospital, and when he'd first held his son, he'd understood why his own father's absence had hurt so deeply. This tiny person deserved everything Luis could give, and walking away would never be an option. They'd bought a small house in Maryvale, nothing fancy but with a yard where Miguel could play, and Sofia could plant the vegetable garden she'd always dreamed of. Luis had taken a job with a commercial cleaning company, working his way up to supervisor, while Sofia found work at a pediatric clinic. They'd been building something beautiful and simple and theirs. The cancer diagnosis had come without warning. Sofia had been tired, but she was always tired, working full-time and chasing a toddler. The persistent cough seemed like allergies until it didn't. By the time they caught it, the disease had spread too far for the treatments they could afford. Luis had tried everything: second opinions, experimental trials, even considered selling the house to pay for procedures their insurance wouldn't cover. Sofia had stopped him. Sitting in their bed on a Sunday morning while Miguel played with blocks on the floor, she'd taken Luis's hands and made him promise that when she was gone, he wouldn't destroy himself trying to save her. Miguel needed one stable parent more than she needed a few extra months of suffering. She'd made Luis swear he'd find a way to be happy again, that he'd show Miguel what love looked like even after loss. The last year of Sofia's life had been a masterclass in grace, under pressure. She'd recorded bedtime stories for Miguel to listen to when she was too weak to read to him herself. She'd written birthday cards for every year until he turned 18, sealing them in envelopes marked with dates she knew she'd never see. She'd taught Luis how to braid hair, how to pack lunches that other kids wouldn't tease Miguel about, how to be both mother and father to a boy who would barely remember her voice. After Sofia died, Luis had discovered that grief was a full-time job, with no benefits and no vacation days. Miguel had been only 5, old enough to understand that Mama wasn't coming back but too young to process what that meant. Luis had taken the night shift at Meridian Tower specifically because it paid enough to cover childcare during the day and let him be present for Miguel every morning and afternoon. The work was honest and necessary, but Luis knew he was capable of more. Before Sofia got sick, he'd been taking business classes at Phoenix Community College, dreaming of starting his own maintenance company. Those dreams had been packed away with Sofia's medical textbooks and her collection of succulents, relegated to someday when someday felt impossible to imagine. Now sitting across from Rebecca as she described her daughter's injuries, Luis felt something stirring in his chest that had been dormant for 3 years. It wasn't hope exactly, but recognition. This woman needed someone who understood that love meant showing up even when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. She needed someone who knew that caring for a child facing an uncertain future required a different kind of strength than running a company. When Rebecca finally looked up from her tissues, Luis was still there, his dark eyes patient and kind. She seemed surprised, as if she'd forgotten he existed, as if powerful executives weren't supposed to break down in front of the help. "I should let you get back to work," she said, trying to reassemble her professional mask. "What's your daughter's name?" Luis asked, ignoring her dismissal. "Emma," Rebecca replied, and just saying it made her eyes fill again. "Emma's lucky to have a mother who loves her enough to cry for her," Luis said quietly. "That's gonna matter more than anything the doctors can do." Something in his voice made Rebecca really look at him for the first time. This wasn't the generic reassurance of someone trying to escape an awkward situation. This was the wisdom of someone who'd walked through fire and survived. "How do you know?" she asked. Luis was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth this stranger could handle. Finally, he spoke. "Because I know what it looks like when someone you love needs you to be stronger than you thought possible. And I know that love finds a way to be enough, even when everything else falls apart." 3 weeks after that, night in Rebecca's office, Luis was surprised to find her waiting by his cleaning cart when he arrived for his shift. She looked different somehow, less polished than usual, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her typical power suits. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. "I need to ask you something," she said without preamble. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." Luis set down his supplies and gave her his full attention. In the weeks since Emma's accident, he'd noticed Rebecca leaving earlier each evening, her office light going dark by 9 instead of staying on until midnight. The executive assistants whispered that she was taking calls from doctors and physical therapists between meetings, that she'd converted one of the conference rooms into a temporary command center for coordinating Emma's care. "I've been watching you," Rebecca continued, and Luis raised an eyebrow. "Not in a weird way," she added quickly. "I mean, I've been noticing things. You know everyone's name in this building, from the security guards to the executives. People light up when they see you coming. Even Mrs. Patterson from accounting, and she hasn't smiled since the Clinton administration." Luis couldn't help but chuckle at that. Mrs. Patterson was legendary for her stern demeanor, but he'd discovered she had a grandson Miguel's age and loved hearing stories about kids being kids. "The thing is," Rebecca continued, "Emma's coming home from the hospital next week, and I have no idea what I'm doing. The doctors gave me a stack of manuals about wheelchair accessibility and physical therapy schedules, but they can't teach me how to help her believe her life isn't over. How do you help a child find hope when you're barely hanging on to your own?" The question hit Luis harder than he'd expected. He thought about Miguel's first year after Sofia died, how his son had stopped laughing for months, how bedtime had become a battleground because sleep meant missing Mama even more. He thought about the night Miguel had asked if Daddy was going to die too, and how Luis had promised with a certainty he didn't feel that he wasn't going anywhere. "You want my advice?" Luis asked. "I want more than that," Rebecca said, and her voice carried a note of desperation. "I want to hire you." Luis stared at her. "You want to hire a janitor to clean your house?" "I want to hire a father to teach me how to be a parent when everything feels impossible," Rebecca replied. "Emma needs someone who understands that love isn't about having all the answers. She needs someone who knows how to make a child feel safe when the world has become scary and unpredictable." Rebecca explained that Emma's rehabilitation would require round-the-clock attention for the first few months. Physical therapy 3 times a week, occupational therapy twice a week, tutoring to keep up with school, and constant emotional support as she adjusted to her new reality. Rebecca had already taken a leave of absence from Meridian, but she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay ahead. "I've been a CEO for 8 years," she said. "I can negotiate million-dollar contracts and manage 100-person teams, but I don't know how to help my daughter tie her shoes from a wheelchair. I don't know how to make her breakfast fun when she's angry at the world. I don't know how to answer when she asks me why this happened to her." Luis found himself thinking about Miguel, who would be finishing his homework about now at their neighbor Rosa's house. Rosa had been watching Miguel after school since Sofia died, but she was 73 and couldn't keep up much longer. The job Rebecca was offering would pay 3 times what he made at Meridian, enough to finally give Miguel the stability Luis had been struggling to provide. But more than the money, something about Rebecca's desperation reminded him of his own grief. The way loving someone completely could make you feel utterly helpless when they were hurting. He'd learned through trial and error how to be both mother and father to Miguel, how to braid hair and pack nutritious lunches, and have conversations about feelings that didn't come naturally to him. Maybe those hard-won skills could help another child navigate an impossible situation. "I'll need to bring Miguel," Luis said finally. "I won't take a job that means less time with my son." "Of course," Rebecca said immediately. Emma could probably use a friend anyway. They worked out the details over coffee in the building's 24th floor break room. Luis would start the following Monday, helping with Emma's daily care while she adjusted to life at home. He'd assist with physical therapy exercises, help maintain her medical equipment, and provide what Rebecca called general moral support during the hardest days of adjustment. What neither of them anticipated was how quickly Emma and Miguel would become inseparable. When Luis brought his son to Rebecca's sprawling Scottsdale house for the first time, Miguel had taken one look at Emma, sitting in her new wheelchair on the back patio, and walked straight over to introduce himself. "Hi," he'd said with the matter-of-fact friendliness of an 8-year-old. "I'm Miguel. My dad says you're learning how to do everything differently now." That sounds hard, but also kinda cool. Emma had been suspicious at first. Most of her friends from school had visited once, and then found excuses not to come back, uncomfortable with her wheelchair and the medical equipment scattered around her room. But Miguel seemed genuinely curious about how everything worked, asking questions about her physical therapy exercises and whether her wheelchair could go fast enough to race. Within a week, Miguel was incorporating Emma's physical therapy into elaborate games they invented together. Her arm-strengthening exercises became sword-fighting practice. Her balance work turned into competitions to see who could hold yoga poses longer. Miguel would position himself at Emma's eye level when they talked, sitting on the floor or pulling up a chair, making her feel like an equal participant rather than someone to be looked down upon. Luis watched their friendship develop with amazement and relief. Miguel had been an only child carrying the weight of being his father's entire world, and having Emma to care about seemed to bring out a protective, nurturing side Luis hadn't seen before. Emma, meanwhile, began smiling again for the first time since her accident, her laughter echoing through the house as she and Miguel plotted increasingly elaborate adventures. Rebecca, who had been working from her home office between Emma's therapy sessions, found herself drawn into their games. Luis would discover her on the living room floor, helping Miguel and Emma build blanket forts that were wheelchair accessible, or in the kitchen teaching them both how to make cookies, while accommodating Emma's limited reach from her chair. "I never played much as a child," Rebecca confessed to Luis one afternoon as they watched the kids race Emma's wheelchair around the pool deck. "My parents believed in structured activities and measurable achievements. I had tutors and music lessons and tennis coaches, but I don't remember ever just playing for the joy of it." Luis had learned pieces of Rebecca's story during quiet moments between Emma's treatments. She'd grown up as the only child of pharmaceutical executives who treated parenting like another business venture to be optimized. Emma's father had been a brief marriage that ended when Emma was 3, leaving Rebecca to raise her daughter while building her career. She'd thrown herself into being the perfect single mother the same way she approached everything else, with detailed schedules and measurable goals. The accident had shattered that illusion of control, forcing Rebecca to confront the reality that love couldn't be managed like a quarterly earnings report. She needed to learn how to be present in moments of uncertainty, how to find joy in small victories, how to help Emma build a life that wasn't defined by what she could no longer do. Luis found himself becoming not just Emma's caregiver but Rebecca's teacher, showing her how to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, how to have serious conversations while doing silly activities, how to make every meal an opportunity for connection rather than just nutrition. He taught her that children needed consistency more than perfection, presence more than presence. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into Luis's employment, during one of Emma's particularly difficult days. She'd been working with her physical therapist on transfers from her wheelchair to other surfaces, and the session had ended in tears of frustration when she couldn't complete a movement that had been automatic before her accident. Rebecca had tried to comfort her daughter with logical explanations about healing, taking time, and progress not being linear, but Emma had rolled away to her room and slammed the door. Luis had found Rebecca in the kitchen afterward, crying into her hands with the same desperation he'd witnessed that first night in her office. "I don't know how to help her," Rebecca whispered. "Everything I say makes it worse. She needs someone who actually understands what she's going through." Luis sat beside her at the kitchen island, watching Miguel through the window as he practiced wheelchair basketball shots by himself, giving Emma space to be angry while staying close enough to be available when she was ready. "You know what Emma needs most," Luis said quietly. "She needs to see that you're not afraid of her anger. She needs to know that loving her doesn't depend on her being brave or positive or grateful. She needs to see that you'll stay with her even when she's falling apart." That evening, instead of trying to cheer Emma up or solve her problems, Rebecca simply sat on her daughter's bedroom floor and cried with her. They talked about how unfair life could be, how scary it was to face an uncertain future, how hard it was to need help with things that used to be easy. For the first time since the accident, Emma felt truly heard rather than managed. From that day forward, Rebecca began approaching her daughter's recovery differently. Instead of focusing solely on medical milestones and therapy goals, she started paying attention to moments of genuine connection. She learned to celebrate Emma's laughter as much as her physical progress, to honor her daughter's grief as well as her resilience. Luis watched Rebecca transform from a CEO trying to manage her daughter's disability into a mother learning to love without conditions. And somewhere in the process of teaching her those lessons, he began to remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. The attack came from Marcus Blackwood, Rebecca's former business partner and current board member at Meridian Medical Technologies. Marcus had been circling like a vulture since Rebecca took her leave of absence, questioning her commitment to the company and suggesting that personal crises made for unreliable leadership. What Luis discovered by accident would expose the depths of Marcus's ambition and the lengths he was willing to go to destroy Rebecca's reputation. It started with a phone call Luis overheard while helping Emma with her evening exercises. Rebecca was in her home office, door slightly ajar, speaking in the clipped tones she used when barely containing her anger. Marcus was on speakerphone, his voice dripping with false concern as he outlined what he called board concerns about her extended absence. "The Shanghai deal is stalling without your direct involvement," Marcus was saying. "The investors are getting nervous about leadership stability. Some are asking whether Emma's situation has compromised your ability to make difficult decisions." Luis could see Rebecca's jaw clench as she responded. "My daughter's recovery doesn't affect my business judgment, Marcus. The Shanghai timeline was always optimistic, and you know it." "Perhaps," Marcus replied smoothly, "but perception matters in this business. Having your home turned into a medical facility, hiring unqualified caregivers, isolating yourself from the company you built, it sends a message about priorities." The phrase unqualified caregivers hit Luis like a physical blow. He realized Marcus was talking about him, dismissing him as some random person Rebecca had picked up off the street. But there was something else in Marcus's tone, a calculated malice that suggested this conversation was about more than business concerns. Over the following weeks, Luis began noticing strange occurrences around Rebecca's house. Photographers with telephoto lenses positioned across the street, taking pictures of him arriving with Miguel each morning. Delivery trucks that seemed to linger longer than necessary in the driveway. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered rooms. The pieces came together when Miguel found a manila envelope that had been slipped under Rebecca's front door. Inside were photographs of Luis entering and leaving the house, along with a typed note that made Luis's blood run cold. CEO Rebecca Chen's secret relationship with her domestic employee raises questions about judgment and professional boundaries. Sources close to the situation report inappropriate conduct between Chen and her hired help, a former janitor with a criminal background check pending. The lies were expertly crafted, mixing just enough truth with fabrication to seem credible. Luis had indeed been a janitor, and Rebecca had indeed hired him for domestic work. But the suggestion of impropriety and the completely false claim about a criminal background were designed to destroy both their reputations simultaneously. Rebecca found Luis in the kitchen an hour later, staring at the photographs spread across the granite countertop. Her face went pale as she read the accompanying note, understanding immediately what they were dealing with. "Marcus," she said simply, her voice flat with resignation. "He's been planning this since I took leave. He wants me out so he can position himself as interim CEO, then make it permanent." Luis felt sick thinking about Emma and Miguel, who were upstairs working on a science project together, blissfully unaware that their fathers' lives were about to be turned upside down. "What does this mean?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It means I have to fire you," Rebecca said, and her voice cracked slightly. "Tonight. Before this gets out to the media. If there's any appearance of impropriety, the board will use it to remove me entirely. I'm sorry, Luis. I'm so sorry." The next morning, Luis packed his few belongings from Rebecca's house, while Emma and Miguel watched in confused silence. He'd tried to explain that sometimes adults had to make difficult decisions for business reasons, but Emma's tears and Miguel's bewildered questions made it clear that they understood only that their family was being torn apart for reasons beyond their control. "This isn't fair," Emma said from her wheelchair, her voice shaking with anger. "You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Miguel. Why does everything good have to get taken away?" Luis knelt beside her chair, his heart breaking at the defeat in her voice. "Sometimes people in power make selfish choices that hurt innocent people," he said carefully. "But that doesn't mean the good things weren't real. Our friendship, the progress you've made, the way you and Miguel look out for each other, nobody can take that away." Miguel tugged on Luis's shirt, his 8-year-old face serious and determined. "Dad, can't we fight back? Like in the movies when the bad guys try to win by cheating?" "Real life isn't like the movies, Mijo," Luis replied, though privately he was wondering the same thing. "Sometimes fighting back just makes things worse for everyone." But as Luis drove away from Rebecca's house, watching Miguel wave goodbye to Emma through the rear window, he felt something shift inside him. Marcus Blackwood had counted on Luis being too powerless and too scared to fight back, assuming that a former janitor wouldn't have the resources or connections to challenge a wealthy businessman. What Marcus didn't know was that Luis had spent 3 years learning every corner of Meridian Tower, building relationships with everyone from security guards to executive assistants, people who saw everything and were often invisible to those in power. That evening, Luis made a phone call to David Restrepo, the night security supervisor at Meridian Tower and Luis's closest friend from his janitor days. David had worked security for 15 years and had a photographer's memory for details that seemed insignificant until they weren't. "I need to know everything you can tell me about Marcus Blackwood's late-night activities," Luis said. "Meeting schedules, phone calls, anything that seemed unusual in the past few months." David was quiet for a moment. "You sure you want to go down this road, Hermano? Men like Blackwood have ways of making problems disappear." "He's already made me disappear," Luis replied. "Now I want to return the favor." What David revealed over coffee the next morning was a pattern of after-hours meetings between Marcus and Meridian's biggest competitors, conversations that should have been reported to the board but never were. Marcus had been positioning himself as the company's future leader by secretly negotiating deals that would benefit him personally, while undermining Rebecca's vision for the company. More damaging was David's recollection of a late-night conversation he'd overheard between Marcus and a private investigator 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had been paying for surveillance on Rebecca's house, looking for anything that could be used to question her fitness for leadership. The investigator had been frustrated by the lack of real scandal, leading Marcus to suggest they create their own narrative. Luis spent the next 2 days gathering evidence, using contacts throughout the building to piece together a timeline of Marcus's betrayal. Rebecca's former assistant, who had been forced to transfer to another department when Rebecca took leave, provided copies of emails that showed Marcus had been undermining Rebecca's projects months before Emma's accident. The IT department revealed unusual access patterns showing Marcus had been reviewing Rebecca's confidential files without authorization. Armed with this information, Luis made a decision that would either vindicate them both or destroy what remained of his reputation. He called an emergency meeting with Meridian's board of directors, claiming to have evidence of corporate misconduct that required immediate attention. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the same conference room where Luis had overheard Marcus plotting against Rebecca months earlier. As Luis walked into that room wearing his only suit, the same one he'd worn to job interviews before Rebecca hired him, He thought about Emma asking why good things always got taken away, and Miguel wondering if they could fight back like in the movies. Sometimes Luis thought, as he opened his folder of evidence, real life could be like the movies after all. The boardroom fell silent as Luis finished presenting his evidence. Marcus sat frozen at the opposite end of the mahogany table, his face ashen as the weight of his exposed schemes settled over the room. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock as they absorbed the documented proof of corporate espionage and character assassination. "These are serious allegations," said Patricia Holbrook, the board chairwoman, her voice carefully measured. "Mr. Blackwood, how do you respond to these claims?" Marcus attempted to regain his composure, straightening his tie and clearing his throat. "This is obviously a desperate attempt by an unemployed janitor to create drama and distract from Rebecca's poor judgment in hiring unqualified personnel for sensitive family matters." "Unqualified?" Luis stood, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I helped Emma Chen regain hope after a devastating accident. I watched her go from despair to laughter, from isolation to friendship with my son. I may not have an MBA, but I know what it means to show up for someone when they need you most." He pulled out his phone and played a video Miguel had recorded the week before, showing Emma and him racing wheelchairs down her hallway, both children giggling uncontrollably. "This is what Emma looked like before your campaign to destroy her mother's reputation. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what qualifications do you have for bringing joy back into a child's life?" The room watched in stunned silence as the video continued, showing Emma confidently transferring from her wheelchair to complete physical therapy exercises while Miguel cheered her on. Her progress was undeniable, her happiness genuine. Patricia turned to Marcus with ice in her voice. "You hired investigators to surveil a board member's private residence while her daughter was recovering from a traumatic injury? You falsified evidence to remove a sitting CEO?" Within 20 minutes, Marcus had been voted out of his board position and faced potential criminal charges for corporate fraud. The board issued a formal apology to Rebecca and requested her immediate return as CEO, with full support for whatever family arrangements she needed to make. Luis drove straight to Rebecca's house, finding her in the garden with Emma and Miguel, who were planting flowers in raised beds designed for wheelchair accessibility. When he told them what had happened, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears of relief and vindication. "I can't believe you did this," she whispered. "You risked everything to clear both our names." "Someone very wise once told me that love means showing up even when it's the hardest thing in the world," Luis replied, smiling at Emma. "I learned that from watching a little girl work harder than anyone should have to, and from seeing her mother refuse to give up on her." Emma wheeled over and grabbed Luis's hand. "Does this mean you and Miguel are coming home?" Luis looked at Rebecca, seeing not the intimidating CEO he'd first met, but the woman who had learned to play on living room floors and cry with her daughter when life felt impossible. "If your mom will have us." 6 months later, Luis officially became Rebecca's partner in both business and life. She had restructured Meridian to include a new division focused on accessibility technology, with Luis leading the team that ensured their products met real-world needs of families like theirs. His first project was developing affordable home modification systems for children with mobility challenges. Emma returned to school with Miguel as her constant advocate, the two of them inseparable as they navigated 4th grade together. She joined the robotics club, where her wheelchair became an advantage in designing low-profile robots, and started a peer support group for other kids facing physical challenges. On their wedding day, held in the same garden where Emma and Miguel had planted their friendship flowers, Emma served as Rebecca's maid of honor, while Miguel stood proudly as Luis's best man. During the ceremony, Emma gave a speech that brought everyone to tears. "My dad Luis taught me that families aren't just people who look the same or came from the same place," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Families are people who choose to love each other every single day, especially on the hard days. Today, we're not just getting a wedding. We're proving that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the worst situations." As Luis and Rebecca exchanged vows under the Arizona sky, surrounded by the children who had brought them together and the community that had supported their unconventional love story, Luis thought about that rainy night 3 years ago when he'd heard a mother crying in her office. He'd had no idea that choosing compassion over convenience would lead to this moment, this family, this life he'd never dared to imagine. Sometimes the most important decisions were the simplest ones: to stop, to listen, to help, to love without conditions. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the world rewarded that choice with everything you never knew you needed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.